Hello, guys. This is Mr. Cole. Going through as we continue on talking about inflation. Now, this is going to be the very last section of our notes for this unit. With that, make sure that you get all your notes written in and go back and watch our videos for review. If you remember, we've been talking about inflation and the inflation being the raise in level of prices as prices get more expensive across the entire economy. Not just one product that gets more expensive, but a lot that get more expensive, right? With that, this erodes the purchasing power that we have, right? What used to cost $1 now costs $2. So as a result, the $1 does not buy you as much as it used to. Last week, you focused on the measurements of inflation, the consumer price index, and the way that that is calculated. You also looked at how we use the CPI to actually find the real price of a product is. And that's all stuff from last week. So I'm not going to go over that again. You can go back in the videos and check that out. Today, we'll look at more of the kind of supply and demand reason why it happens and kind of what we do with inflation now that we know it exists and how to calculate it. So inflation, from about 1 to 3% inflation every year is okay. The government is fine with that. In fact, that's actually the target goal. 3 might be a little high for some governments, but about 1 to 2 to 3%. If prices are going up about 1 to 3% every year, that's fine. In fact, that's actually okay. We'd actually rather have that. We'll get into why in a second. We call this type of inflation creeping inflation because it's as if the inflation is just slowly creeping up. So you got to think, if we're going 3% inflation every year, that means in the course of, about 30 years, prices will completely have doubled, okay? What we don't want is for rapid increases in inflation. That is bad because that is going to throw an economy off entirely. Okay, I think of it like I don't know if you're a runner, an athlete, right? And you're running a marathon. Okay, you don't just show up one day and run 26 miles, right? You do a little bit, maybe 1 or 2 miles, then 3 or 4 the next day, then 5 or 6, and you build your way up. That's what creeping inflation does. When we get into the galloping inflation or even hyperinflation, it's when something happens in the economy that just shoots prices up like crazy fast. And as a result, that is a shock to your system, right? That's like trying to run that 26-mile marathon, right off your couch, right? It's going to shock the economy and probably cause a recession. The most famous example of hyperinflation would be the Germans before or after World War I. Here are German school children who it was cheaper to just hand them the money to play with and let them cut up than it was to actually use the money to go and buy toys. So the toys were so expensive that it was easier just to hand them the banknotes and just let them cut them up, mess around with them, put glue on them, whatever. Okay. A more modern day example of hyperinflation comes from Venezuela. Now, there's a lot of complex reasons as to why Venezuela is having such a troubled economy, but that are the number of Venezuelan dollars that would be needed to buy one roll of toilet paper. And I thought that was kind of fitting in our current situation as well. But this is seen across the entire economy in Venezuela as a result of a lot of shortages of products. The prices are just galloping through the roof and really crazy. Now, that being said, inflation looks bad, but what's honestly worse than inflation is deflation. Deflation is when prices decrease across an entire economy. Now, deflation is very rare. Okay, it only happens when economic activity is low, when we're entering recessions or even worse, economic depressions. Okay, prices going down seems like a good thing, but when we look at what actually causes inflation, you will see why it's so bad. Just to show you an example, okay, so here's the consumer price index since 1927. Okay, anything above this line there was inflation, anything below the line there was deflation. You can see the years that we had the worst deflation. 1930s, right? And even the time before the 30s, leading up to the Great Depression. Okay, some other times where you see most of these align with one of these gray lines. These gray lines mean a recession. Okay, so you can see generally, not all the time, as the 1970s show you, but most of the time, when we have recessions, they correspond with deflation as well. Now, That is because of what actually causes inflation and deflation. As everything in economics is, you can answer the question based on supply and demand. Inflation is caused either by the change in demand or a change in supply. So the first example of inflation is called demand pull inflation. Basically, the idea is demand shifts first and it pulls the prices up with it. When consumers are confident and demand is rising, okay, people are buying more things than producers can keep up with. Okay, so as a result, people then spend more money on products. Oftentimes, if you have excess money in the economy, if people have too much money in the economy, this is what occurs. Here's a picture of it. So here's our original supply and demand. Okay, as demand shifts to the right, it causes prices across the entire economy to rise. However, it also causes our GDP to rise. This is why 1 to 3% inflation is not a bad thing. It's because it was the inflation happened because demand got higher, which caused real GDP to grow. When real GDP grows, we know people have more jobs, more things get made, and the economy is expanding. So anytime that the economy is expanding, you're going to see a raise in prices. Okay? Now, the kind of inflation that is really bad is called cost push inflation. Essentially, supply side inflation. This is when when production costs, right, making things gets more expensive. It's harder for companies to make things. When it's harder for companies to make things, this pushes prices up. Now, you will see why this is so bad in this chart. Okay, here's our original supply and demand, right? Right here's demand, here's your original supply. Here's why it's so bad. As things get harder to make, okay, supply shifts to the left and shifts over here to the supply line too. Well, what that causes is a raise in price, just like you saw in the last one. However, look what happens to our GDP. Our overall economic output drops as a result of this raise in price. We stop producing as much, meaning more people are going to get laid off, less people are going to have jobs, and the economy is going to be in a recession. This is the bad type of inflation. It's inflation was nicknamed in the 70s stagflation, a combination of a stagnant economy mixed with inflation because the economy is not expanding and prices are still going up. And that's a very, very bad situation to be in. We were in that in the 1970s. We'll get that more later on in other units. Now, ultimately, the impact of inflation, how inflation actually affects us and businesses. Obviously, we've been over this, decreases the value of the dollar. Okay, so that means that our money's now worth less. However, that is good if you are in a borrower. Let's say you have borrowed student loans or you have borrowed a mortgage on a house. If you took out $100,000 for a house, but inflation happens over the course of 30 years, that $100,000 is not worth what it used to be, right? Now a house for 100 grand would probably be worth 200 grand, right? So now you owe only 100 grand on a house that's only worth almost 200,000 now. So you've actually gained as a result of inflation, okay? Now, businesses and banks know this, of course, so they will often increase interest rates during times of inflation. They will consistently try and change their interest rates to try and make up for that money that is lost. The other big area that you lose on inflation is for people with saving their money, right? Let's say you have a savings account that earns 1% interest. Well, if there's 3% interest that year, you've actually lost money by the end of the year. So our real returns on savings don't often keep up with inflation. This is why so many people are advised to try and invest in the stock market, because you're not going to get higher than 3 or 4% from the banks. You could get that from the stock market. So that's what drives people there, is that just keeping your money in the bank and earning interest, you're actually losing money while you're doing that. Okay? So inflation, what's the final grade on it? Not good, not bad. It's just kind of a way of life, right? It can get bad in cases like Venezuela and Germany, right? It can get really bad during times of deflation, okay? But overall, it just kind of impacts all of us, right? You got to keep in mind that we're going to have about 3% inflation every year. So if you're getting a raise at work and it's only a 1% raise at work, guess what? You're actually making less money the following year than you did before. So it's just something to be aware of. It's kind of a part of the way the economy goes. And that is where we're going to finish up with this Unit 4, okay? So make sure you go back and watch any of the videos to review. Great job, guys. I'll see you later.